welcome once again to the BCS podcast. This episode we are going to focus on the Manosphere. This is a podcast predominantly about sport, and there is a big intersection between the Manosphere and sport. There are guys linked to the Manosphere who are fronting explicitly sports-focused enterprises. Guys like Pat McAfee and Dave Portnoy, for example. The real big issue when we think about the Manosphere is the guys that you immediately think of when you hear the term Manosphere. People like Andrew Tate, Theo, Vonn and Joe Rogan, for example. And these are all guys who look to explicitly link themselves to sport. One of the only things that I knew about Andrew Tate before I started making this episode was that he was a kickboxer, for example. Joe Rogan, meanwhile, is part of the UFC furniture, and I don't think there is a single UFC fight that I have ever seen where he isn't at ringside commentating before then going into the octagon to interview the winners after the fights. When we think about issues connected to sports, then the Manosphere is one of the big ones currently. I started my journey by reading as much as I could on the subject, and it has to be said there is a lot of material out there, from long reads in national newspapers through to academic papers. To then learn even more, I contacted one of the authors of those academic papers. Dr Christopher Finlay is an Associate Professor of Communication Studies at Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles, California. He specialises in digital media cultures, sports communication, global media industries and political communications, and recently co-authored a paper on the Manosphere's relationship with sport. I spoke to him back in July, and here is the first part of our conversation. Can I start by getting you to talk about your research into the Manosphere and what that has encompassed, please?
Absolutely. So my research in the Manosphere actually started really within thinking about it through the lens of sport and how sport plays a role in the Manosphere. And what I became increasingly more interested in was the connections between sport and far-right politics. And really indirect connections, I should clarify. But how we saw increasingly over the last decade, far-right leaders like obviously Donald Trump in the United States, but also individuals like Modi, Bolsonaro, align themselves with sports and sports communities, particular sports as well, in order to try and bolster their authenticity claims to largely male audiences, largely working class male audiences. So that's really where I began to explore this area.
So is to your mind, and through the research that you've done, do you think that is why a lot of the influencers in this Manosphere space tend to associate themselves with sports a lot? Like the example that I've given to everyone that I've chatted to is that Andrew Tate is very vocal about the fact that he used to be a champion kickboxer, for example.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I would like to maybe take a step back and say that this isn't a new concept, right? If you look at, for instance, the history in the UK, for instance, of the National Front, if you can go right back to the 1970s and 80s, where they were associating themselves very explicitly with football in order to try and do the same recruitment strategies that we see today. In terms of the big Manosphere influencers, so for instance, Tate or Rogan, both of them have a background in sport that they want to accentuate. And that's largely because they're using sport as a way to signal their inherent masculinity. Right. I think that it also is a way to signal a particular class perspective. It's sort of understood to be more working class or working class towards middle class, and there is an authenticity there as well that they are trying to signal. The relationship, if I can, between sports masculinity and class, I think, is something that has been explored by sports sociologists, but it's something that still needs a fair bit more exploration, particularly the way that we see influencers use it today.
Sure. So, in your mind, then, like, what role does sports media have to play in this space? Then, should sports media be addressing what is said in the manosphere? Should the on-air personalities be engaging with that content?
Well, that's a difficult question. And that's a difficult question because we have to ask ourselves what we mean by sports media first. And so, I'll give you a very simple example. When we say should, are we talking about should in terms of some sort of policy structure at either a corporate policy structure or a legal policy structure? And the answer for the legal side, anyways, would be it depends on what country you're in. If we're talking about BBC Sport, well, okay, the charter could indirectly address that, right? But if you're in the United States, ESPN can just use the First Amendment over and over and over to make claims that they don't have to. So there's an interesting legal space there. In terms of the more sort of ethical question, that's a difficult question as well, and for a series of different reasons, I think. One is I was made reference to the fact that often the connections are indirect, right? They're not explicit, and so can you blame some sports broadcasters or sports media more generally for having some of their on-air talent or even some of their coverage remixed and rearticulated by Manosphere influencers? That becomes a bit of a slippery slope, right? Now, at the same time, you've got people, for instance, like the Pat McAfee show that you'd mentioned to me off air, that are openly endorsing and welcoming and embracing this content. That is an interesting question for a company, particularly a family values company like Disney, right? That they are allowing that. So I do think that there should be some sort of internal discussion.
It's important that we don't only hear from one person when discussing the manosphere, though. When friend of the show, Dr Mimi Thebo, isn't talking passionately and knowledgeably about the Kansas City Chiefs, she lectures at the University of Bristol in the southwest of England. Furthermore, she is also an award-winning children's author whose work is aimed primarily at young teenagers, a group who many influencers in the manosphere look to target. Here is what she had to say when I asked her for her thoughts on the manosphere's relationship with sport.
I don't really like the term manosphere. I don't think it's actually that pervasive. I think there's a lot of content, but I don't think it's that joined up. And I think that young men, in my experiences as an academic, get into this largely through loneliness, and either that or kind of they enjoy the humor, the kind of irreverent take on things that they find there. In terms of its link to sports, I think that, again, there's kind of an epidemic of loneliness in men, in young men, and in middle-aged men, that is probably more to do with the way office culture and work culture has changed, and the way we're less likely to live close to extended family than it is any particular political or psychological problems, pervasive psychological problems. So, according to the June Ofcom study, most men who participate in what we call the manosphere don't do so religiously, but kind of dip in and out, and are drawn to various things, particularly kind of the irreverent humor, and don't always take on board all of the values that are expressed. So what do we do about this? And it's all about critical thinking. Not all opinions are equal. I mean, everybody's got the right to say them, but that doesn't mean that they're all equal. And concentrating on evidence-based opinions, evidence thought, understanding that evidence is required and not just a system of thought that somebody just thinks up because it sounds nice or it excuses their behavior. These are the skills that we really need to develop as a society.
I have all the respect in the world for Mimi, and I want to make very clear that I have spoken to her privately about this beforehand, but I do have to disagree with her on one point. In her comments, she said that not all opinions are equal because some of them are based on how the person feels rather than being based upon evidence. For me, that is part of the problem in this debate about the manosphere, is that some people will hear what Mimi said, and what they will hear is a middle class female academic saying your feelings don't matter, when they very much do, and we need to encourage men to talk about their feelings more. Maybe part of the solution then is that people on the side of the debate that want to counter the manosphere need to alter their rhetoric somewhat to make it clear that they do think that people's feelings do count, they are important, and they want to know why they feel that way. Because essentially, everyone just wants to be seen and everyone wants to be heard. Because in that regard, the men in the manosphere think that the people who are speaking to them and speaking for them are the Andrew Tates of the world. In that regard then, we all need to listen to what they are saying and recognise that not all of them are making blanket reprehensible statements, and that there is actually some nuance in some of the points that they are making. In that regard, that is one of the things that I was very impressed by when I read the paper that was co-authored by Dr Christopher Finlay, is that he and his co-author recognised that there is nuance in the manosphere space, and that there are guys who make up the bulk of this manosphere community who are just ordinary blokes who are like my age and younger, and they will actually have a range of views as any community would have. And so some of them would very much not want to be tarred with the same brush as the likes of Andrew Tate and Theo Vonn on certain issues. Here is the second part of my conversation with Dr Chris Finlay on this issue.
One of the arguments that my colleagues and I who work in this space are trying to make, that is sometimes at odds with many other folks that are researching this space, is that the manosphere is not a homogenous space. It's actually, I joke it should be the Manosphere, which is a terrible joke, but it does actually capture something important, which is that there's a diversity of viewpoints in that space. And in fact, the Manosphere is largely internet discussion, right? And so in that space, if it's a discursive space, you have to ask yourselves, well, what is the reason that this has cropped up? And one of the reasons it's cropped up, as ugly as it can be, and it is extraordinarily ugly, I will not apologize for any of the sexist or racist material that show up regularly. There are conversations that have not been part of the mainstream discourse for quite a while, right? And many of the men around the nature of masculinity, right? The relationship between masculinity and suicidality and deaths of despair more generally. A number of those issues that I think actually that are largely, you and I off air had mentioned, to talk about the crisis of masculinity, that confluence of topics around the crisis of masculinity that do not get the coverage, at least in American media, that you would expect, right? Or if they do, it's sometimes more of a moral panic coverage. And because what we're responding to is arguably some of the worst content to come out of that space, right? And so we have to ask ourselves, okay, for every Andrew Tate that is out there saying absolutely absurd, dangerous things, how many other conversations are happening in that space that maybe do not reach that level, or importantly, and this is what some of our research has uncovered, are actively taking on Andrew Tate in that space, right? And so it's one of the reasons we study this area is because we are interested in looking at that discourse and saying, okay, it is overwhelmingly problematic, but what is it a response to? right? And I would argue it's a response to late capitalism, and men not finding purpose. You've got, men not going to college and what have you, right? And so you've got this large under or unemployed group of individuals, whose very identity, by interestingly, through the media, is still being accentuated in terms of old 20th century constructions of masculinity. At the same time, they're being told that those are problematic. And they're caught in this strange bind, right? Between sort of the siren call of the Andrew Tates of the world, who are saying embrace this chauvinistic, disgusting construction of masculinity, in response to the fact that you find yourself in an identity crisis and in an economic crisis that's tied into that. And that there isn't a clear articulation by many mainstream political leaders, or even by parts of Hollywood, because they don't want to speak to that, because they're worried about being tainted by the ugliness of the more sort of right wing extremism that I think strategically identified that population as a target population first, and then has molded the way, at least molded the norms of that discussion space. But I actually see those men largely in crisis, and the only people speaking to them are actually those right wingers, at least speaking to them consistently.
Sure.
I would say
Okay,
that yeah, sorry, I'm going on for quite a bit, but I do think
no,
that
you're
there's
the
an interesting
expert, so I
thing
want
there.
to hear what you say.
Yeah. Yeah, and when we speak about them quite a bit, and the piece that I'm assuming that you came across to, when you found, when you reached out to me, in the conclusion, we actually, explore, so like this late capitalist identity crisis is not being spoken about or interrogated by mainstream academia, by mainstream expertise culture, outside of a few random scholars like, Richard Russo or what have you, right? And so they were just ripe for exploitation. And I think that's a large part of the story.
Sure. And I mean, one thing I would say from looking at this space more deeply is the people that get the most attention are the ones that are expressing the most extreme views. And
Absolutely.
one thing that you've mentioned in the articles of yours that I've read, one thing that you said in this chat, is that the manosphere is not homogenous. It's not a monolith. There is a range of people and a range of views in there. So from what you've seen, do you think there are positive aspects to the manosphere?
Yes, I think there's a positive aspect to, and it's a very, a very qualified yes. Actually, let me clarify.
Sure.
I am not going to again. I'm not going to be an apologist for the manosphere, but I am going to be someone that says we need to take it more seriously and speak to it as opposed to speaking about it. And so let me speak to what the potential positives are. There needs to be a space for men to try and figure out who the hell they are, right? There needs to be a conversation space where some of the issues that men are speaking about, in terms of these conflicting, messages, particularly conflicting media messages, and I'll connect this back to sport. Sport is still, despite I think many steps forward in terms of embracing a more diverse, and more progressive identity, depending on the sport, but overall, I think it has actually changed quite dramatically over the last 25 years in terms of its embrace of certainly different fans, women, LGBT, you name it, right? It still is playing into the concept of the male preserve, which is we are going to try and have basically various Ubermensch go into battle with one another. And so that is still being put forward as the masculine ideal. At the same time that we have mainstream media telling men that's extraordinarily problematic, because the argument is there's a short, very, very, very short pathway between being excellent at sport, let's say, or being excellent, in more of a traditional masculine space, and then suddenly becoming, a Me Too candidate, right? And so the idea is there's a pushback away from that. So you reject your traditional masculine identity. And I would agree. I think actually we should be rejecting very problematic aspects of traditional masculinity. But have we really articulated a clear version of what we could call sort of a new masculinity or a caring masculinity? There are different academic approaches to that, but they stay within the academy. I don't think that they filtered out in any clear way to the mainstream population, and I don't know if the mainstream population is interested, quite frankly. And so if you're caught in that bind, right, where the rhetoric is at once telling you to embrace a type of masculinity that has also been villainized, then what do? Right? And that in that moment, that requires discussion. That requires, careful elaboration. And yes, often those discussions are infantile. The content is reprehensible. But every now and then, as our research has tried to sort of put a spotlight on, you can see elements of resistance. And so when I say the positive is there, the positive is to let the conversation happen and hope some of the logics that would be seen as healthier start to become louder. Are they at that level now? Absolutely not. But because the Manosphere has positioned itself as a response to a censorious left, right? To try and shut it down or to say that there's nothing appropriate there actually adds more fuel to the fire and actually gives more power to those individuals, the right-wing influencers in particular, who are trying to take advantage of this identity crisis for their own wealth and or political power.
Sure. Okay. To that end, then, if we are wanting to find the positive aspects of this space, who are the people in this space that we should be listening to, in your opinion, then?
When we think about specific influencers, that's where I would have trouble. And that's where we can sort of take that political economic lens, hence the qualified yes. The loudest voices are the problematic voices. What I'm interested in terms of any large group space is to actually look at the everyday users and see how far are they willing to follow along and where do they say, no, that's a bridge too far. And so actually I would focus more on the individual users as opposed to specific influencers.
Sure. And I mean, one of the things that has come up as I've looked at this subject is there's this Manosphere view of what a real man is, and a part of what a real man is someone who is good at sport and successful at sport. But then, as a society, we have society telling us as men, you need to be this, you need to be that, and those two things can very much be at odds. Being the strong, successful, dominating sports person, but also being, kind and considerate and compassionate person. How in your mind can athletes marry those two, what can be considered separate identities? How do they marry those identities together then, in your view?
Well, that's an interesting question because I actually don't think they're quite the polar opposite as you suggested in the question. One can be competitive, but also be a good citizen, on the field or on the court. And we're actually, I think that's been I suppose an issue over the last decade or so where we see poor sportsmanship, right? And people refusing to shake hands, calling each other out, verbally on the court, let's say, right? And so I actually think that the sort of traditional masculine virtue of strength doesn't need to be understood as dominance, right? I mean, this is where I think that those conversations in the manosphere have power, which is that a dumbed down version of strength is take everybody down, right? It is sort of a superhero version of the world. But there are other constructions of strength, that I think actually are very positive, right? To be there for your teammates, to be there for your family, to be there for your friends. That construction of strength is something that I actually think sports can model. So yes, I am, a very powerful individual, in my respective, sport. But look at what I do with the success that it has given me, right? Here's how I connect to charity work. Here's how I connect to if I'm doing that 365 Instagram live version of my life, here is how I show respect to everyone in my life, right? Whether it's teammates, family, individuals that are serving me at a restaurant. And so I think part of this is a rehabilitation of the old-fashioned masculine virtues that have actually been sort of, I would argue, the late 20th century to the early 21st century were then understood largely as a negative. It's about trying to resuscitate those by looking at how they can be positive. And that I'm not alone. There's actually some very good scholarship on that out there, that I think is worth exploring, because if we don't take sort of a final thought, if we don't take the manosphere more seriously, it will continue to fester into this cancerous sore that it looks like right now. But if we can think about how it can be worked with and how we can engage the individuals that are in this space, then perhaps we can actually do something more powerful.
Moving on, young people can also be very attracted to the manosphere. I spoke to a number of primary school and secondary school teachers here in the UK who teach children from the age of 4 all the way up to the age of 18 to see what effect the manosphere is having in schools. To protect the identities of the children that they teach, I am going to keep all of the following comments anonymous, and they will be voiced by an AI generator. Here is what one primary school teacher had to say.
None of our children reference manosphere influences by name, and they are not explicit in their actions. But the number of pupils who respond differently to male staff by treating them with more respect, or accepting sanctions or consequences from them when they would challenge female staff about the same thing, has definitely increased. There are no insults about their gender, but with some of the 9 to 11-year-old boys there does seem to be a sense of superiority and contempt towards female staff. We are a single-form entry school, so it is a relatively small sample size. But, for me, in our setting, the biggest influence over children who may be attracted to the manosphere is their fathers and their attitude towards women. They are almost a bridge or gateway to manosphere influences. In the examples that I see, the fathers are single parents who blame their former partners for their circumstances and are openly critical of them, resenting paying maintenance, etc. The children are therefore exposed to a toxic environment which can negatively impact them to varying degrees. I think any sort of pastoral care or therapy, play therapy, music therapy, Lego club, art therapy, sports therapy, that helps children who are upset or going through a traumatic family experience to express themselves and not keep negative emotions inside is a real help and could prevent them from seeking out answers or a place they feel understood in the manosphere. It's expensive though.
And here is what another primary school teacher had to say.
This is something all primary schools are aware of and actively work to challenge. Over the past couple of years, we've shaped our curriculum around themes of equality, as schools need to be responsive to what's happening in wider society. It often starts with seemingly acceptable attitudes being left unchallenged. We do a lot of work around prejudice, sexism, and racism. We've even had to be mindful of fairly innocent topics, like space and the moon landing, which can be just a few clicks away from conspiracy theories or incel content. Our curriculum is designed to help children become more critical of the things they see online and to feel confident questioning them. We do what we can to teach them critical thinking, but there's only so much a school can do. One child who loves football was watching YouTube shorts, and in between the football clips were jokes and skits full of sexualized, misogynistic language about taking girls home. He was too young to really understand it, but that's the point. It's right there, in the middle of the content he was actively searching for. That's how easy it is for this kind of messaging to slip through.
And finally, here are the thoughts of a secondary school teacher.
The problem is worst among 13 and 14-year-old boys. They're starting to look and sound more like adults and think they should be treated as such. We definitely have a problem in our school with some boys not respecting what the female teachers say as much as the male members of staff and backchatting the female teachers more. It's also cultural. Some of these boys come from households where the man is the leader of the house and what they say goes. The influencers they're watching on TikTok are simply reinforcing the beliefs they've been brought up around their whole lives.
Another thing that is very true of the manosphere is that a visible and vocal part of the manosphere is less than complimentary about both women and members of the LGBTQ+ community, particularly when it comes to either playing or even being a fan of sport. Something that I am very proud of is that this podcast has featured multiple women and multiple members of the LGBTQ plus community, because a podcast about sports fandom should feature the entire spectrum of fandom. And that is something that I continue to work hard behind the scenes at trying to improve in that respect. It has been very challenging to convince both women and members of the LGBTQ plus community to come on this podcast. And part of that is because they have been very concerned about opening themselves up to online abuse. This has meant it became even more difficult when I then tried to convince both women and members of the LGBTQ plus community to go on record with their experiences of being a sports fan and any interactions they have had with members of the Manosphere. In that regard then, this episode is much weaker, in my opinion, for not featuring more women and not featuring any members of the LGBTQ plus community. Finally, having spent the last few months researching this subject, learning more about it, and speaking to those who know more about the subject than I do, here are my thoughts on the issue. We have heard in this episode from teachers across the UK that they are having to adapt lesson plans to tackle the fact that there is a rise in certain attitudes among the kids in their schools because of the things that they are seeing and hearing from influencers in the Manosphere space. One of the very few things that I ask my interviewees or contributors to do is not swear, and I also deliberately do not swear when I'm making these episodes. The reason being, if you upload content to YouTube, Spotify or any other platform that contains bad language, you have to mark that episode as containing explicit content, and that severely restricts the potential audience that episode will be served up to. Yes, the BCS podcast is predominantly a British guy talking about US sports, or in some instances social issues or issues related to sports. I want that 13-14-year-old boy who is watching YouTube to come across this episode. I want him to see the episode where Russell Easton talks about the harm that sports betting can have. I want him to see the episodes where Jennifer Annerly and Dr Mimi Thebo talk about how sports venues or the pub cannot always be the most welcoming environment for female sports fans. And I then want him to think about his own behaviour. One of the things that has always been true of this podcast is that I've always tried to remain fair and balanced when doing issue-based episodes, and instead let the guest or the contributor give voice to those issues. I haven't always succeeded, and it has to be said that it's probably been very clear exactly what I thought a couple of times, in fact. This is an issue where I'm prepared to very clearly stick my head above the parapet though. There is a reason why I featured someone like Dr Kelly Wright in Series 2, because I wanted the audience to see a woman who is both a medical doctor and an international athlete who has competed at the very top of her sport. And then in my concluding comments of that episode, I emphasised how hard Kelly works, how after a long shift in an NHS A&E department, she then goes to the gym to ensure that she remains at the top of women's baseball in the UK. Ultimately, I wanted the audience to know that if you work hard enough both academically and recreationally, you can achieve the things that you want to. There is a reason why I have featured Dr Mimi Thebo on multiple occasions and on multiple subjects, because where else in the sports discussion landscape do you see a woman in her 60s being asked her opinion on sports? And oh look, Mimi very clearly knows her stuff on American football, and then she goes and adds an incredible amount of depth to my episode on UK versus US sports fandom by talking about the realities of being a female sports fan. If guys like Andrew Tate had their way, Kelly and Mimi and Jennifer Anley and Jessie Depp and Joe Lenton, none of them would appear on this podcast, because guys like Andrew Tate think that they don't have anything of value to say, and quite frankly the discussion of sport would not be as good because of that. I am not by any stretch of the imagination the type of guy that Andrew Tate thinks should populate the world. I'm single, I don't own my own home, and I don't drive a fancy car. Newsflash, neither does Andrew Tate. For all of his bravado, telling us as men what we should think about women and how we should treat them, he is someone who is currently facing criminal trial in the UK for some of the worst offences on the statute book related to his treatment of women. He also doesn't own a home. He owns a compound that he and some of his followers lock themselves away in because the civilised world, the people that you go to school with, the people that you work with or for, want nothing to do with him. And all those fancy cars that you see him driving, he doesn't own any of them. He leases them for an hour. He gets someone to film a video of him driving a Ferrari or a Maserati or a Lamborghini really fast, and then he drives back to the dealership and hands the keys back to the person who actually owns it. Do not listen to him. He is a fraud who is trying to convince you to listen to the nonsense that is coming out of his mouth. Ultimately, he is trying to draw a veil over his life to conceal his own failings as a man. I was raised by, yes, my mother, to believe that men conduct themselves with integrity and honour. Guys like Andrew Tate have neither integrity nor honour. They are making extreme statements to make money for themselves by leveraging your pain, your dissatisfaction, and the fact that you may not feel that you have a place in the world. They do not deserve to have your time, and they certainly don't deserve to have your respect. Do not get me wrong, I am far from perfect, but I am directing this to anyone who thinks that Andrew Tate and his ilk have anything of value to say. Do not allow them to make a fool of you. They do not deserve to have that kind of influence over you. And on that note, that brings an end to this episode of the BCS podcast. As always, thank you very much for joining me. I hope you have found this episode both interesting and informative, and I certainly hope to see you again next time when I will be discussing something far lighter. Bye bye now. The BCS podcast is written, produced, edited and hosted by me, Brett Walker. Thank you to Boris Anderoff and Pixabay for the use of the music and sound effects in this podcast. This episode's main guest was Dr Christopher Finlay, and also features contributions from Dr Mimi Thebo and a range of school teachers from across the UK.